If you've already viewed the videos on temporary tables, common table expressions, and table variables, you may have a question here, and that is, well, wait a minute, what exactly is the difference? When should I use temporary tables? When should I use common table expressions? Or when should I use table variables? Because they all look kind of similar. They all seem to be doing some tricks, if you will, with the record sets and allowing me to kind of store things temporarily out there in memory and so forth. And it's a really good question, and so let's just kind of go through them one at a time. And I'll point out a couple of things that for a lot of people will end up being kind of the tiebreaker on when you should use one or the other. And again, let me go back to something and tell you, don't be afraid to use one of these because it makes sense to you, you're comfortable with it, you like the way it works. There's plenty of time to go back and after you use it and get comfortable with it to read about it and understand what's going on and make some adjustments. First up, let's look at temporary tables. Temporary tables, I've already talked about it, but let's just kind of review them all together as a group. They persist or they live until they're dropped or until the connection that created them ends. And so the table is going to be there as long as your connection exists and you can keep referring back to it. Now this makes this one very useful even in situations where you do a query and then you create a temporary table and then load the query, so you can do this outside of the stored procedure and do some really cool stuff with it. Now like normal tables, what's really cool about temporary tables is they can have primary keys, constraints, indexes. You can build all those things on temporary tables if you would like. And again, even though these things reside in a temporary database, in the Temp DB database, I guess I should say, they really reside in memory, and you're always going to work with them as a pinned table in memory unless your SQL Server is running low on memory or needs the memory, and at that point it will write that database out into the Temp database and read from it just like a standard user database. But the main thing to think about with temporary tables is this one, and this is the big one. Column statistics are maintained on these temporary tables, which means in English that the query optimizer can get involved in considering whether this piece of information can be used to satisfy a query, and since we can put the indexes and so forth on it, this can be really useful. When we talk about the common table expressions, I don't want to minimize these things, but really can think of these things as if they are temporary views for the way they behave. Now, the one cool thing about common table expressions, you can make them refer to themselves, and this is something that's called recursion, and there's a lot of times that you'll find yourself kind of painted into a corner, and you need to select data from a table that based on the condition that's in that table, and so you can use recursion to do that very easily with common table expressions. But the main thing with common table expressions is they simplify the creation of the query itself. They make it a little easier and cleaner and smoother, if you will, to write that query out and get that action happening. So common table expressions, again, I don't want to sound like I'm minimizing them here, but they really more or less are like temporary views that you can build in your code. And then table variables, now these were red hot when they first came out, and there's a lot of good reasons for them. I don't have to worry about managing these things a whole lot, but what's good about them also ends up being kind of the rub against them, if you will. Table variables get created when we declare them, just like any variable, and they are destroyed when they go out of scope, so we never have to worry about getting rid of them. There's no need to drop them, and you notice here, the reason there's no need to drop them is you can't drop them, because they're created when you declare that variable, and as soon as that script stops and that variable goes out of scope, or remember, as soon as the program control moves to an area that can no longer read that variable, it's dropped and the memory is handed back to the system again. Now this is kind of interesting. Your table variables can have primary keys, so you can establish those and assign them, but you can't do indexing on a table variable. And here's the big one on table variables, and this really becomes what makes you choose between a table variable and a temporary table. And really it comes down to how much data are you putting in, because column statistics are not maintained on table variables, which means the query optimizer never gets involved here, and as a result of not having column statistics, they tend to be less efficient than temporary tables when you're working with a large number of rows. Now what's a large number of rows? Generally, for most, probably the most common way to think about this is somewhere around 8,000 rows. Now where did I get that number? Well, if you go out there and look, and you have to dig hard to find this, but in a couple of places in Microsoft documentation, you can find that when they're talking about when there's enough rows to begin to use indexes and some other optimization techniques, it always falls somewhere around 8,000 rows. Of course, your mileage may vary and all that sort of thing, so test these things and look at them. But the real question here becomes, if I'm using a lot of rows that I'm storing into a table and then I need to do some searches on that table, then I probably want to use a temporary table. Now, if it's just something that I want to just load up and throw a few records into, and in the course of the same execution of this particular script, which makes this great for stored procedures, if I can load it up quick, hit it quick, grab my information, and go somewhere else, table variables are excellent for that. Again, I guess the bottom line is if you're using a lot of rows, go with a temporary table. If you're using a few and you want really fast access, go to table variables. And if you like the clean setup and so forth and the efficiency with a query, common table expressions, again, you really should go out and read about these and familiarize yourself, but pick one or two and start to use them. You can do some really cool stuff, especially in stored procedures with these things.